It's 2 a.m. You're lying in bed, staring at the ceiling, and you're awake for no reason you can name. You didn't drink coffee too late. You didn't doom scroll your phone into a panic. You just woke up, cleanly, in the middle of the night, and now you're doing the thing every insomniac does at this hour, which is quietly panicking about the fact that you're awake. You check the time. You do the math on how many hours of sleep you have left if you fall back asleep right now, this second. You don't. You lie there, annoyed at your own brain, wondering what's wrong with you. Here's a thought that might actually help, and it has nothing to do with sleep hygiene or blue light or magnesium supplements. What's happening to you right now? This exact pattern of falling asleep, waking in the dead of night, lying there for a while, and eventually drifting off again, is not a malfunction. It is not a symptom. For most of the time our species has existed on this planet, it was the default. It was normal sleep. And somewhere in the last 200 years, we managed to forget that so thoroughly that when it happens to us now, we assume our body is broken. So what actually happened after dark before we had switches to flip and screens to numb us? What did people do with the other half of their existence, the half spent in darkness, for the hundreds of thousands of years before electricity made night optional? The honest answer is that historians and archaeologists barely asked this question until embarrassingly recently. And what they found when they finally started looking is stranger, richer, and considerably more interesting than everyone went to bed at sundown and slept until dawn, which is the version most of us have quietly assumed our whole lives without ever being told it directly. Let's start with the version everybody carries around without examining it. The picture goes something like this. Before electric light, people had no choice but to sleep in one long, unbroken stretch, because what else was there to do in the dark? Sunset, sleep, sunrise, repeat. Solid 8 hours, night after night, an unbroken block of unconsciousness bookended by daylight. It sounds reasonable. It's also, according to a mountain of historical evidence uncovered mostly by accident, almost completely wrong. In the early 1990s, a historian named Roger Ekirch was doing research inside London's old public record office, working through centuries of court depositions for what he expected to be a fairly dry chapter on the history of nighttime. He was not looking for anything about sleep patterns specifically. He assumed sleep was a biological constant, the same in every century, not something with its own history. Then he came across the testimony of a 9-year-old girl named Jane Roth, describing the events of an April night in 1699 in a small English village. In her account, she and her mother had just woken from what she casually called their first sleep, when 2 men appeared outside their window and asked her mother to come with them. Jane's mother told her to stay put and that she'd be back by morning. She never returned. Her body was found days later, and the crime, whatever it actually was never solved. What stopped Ekirch cold wasn't the tragedy. It was those 2 words, tossed off with zero explanation, as if any reader from the 17th century would obviously know what a first sleep was and wouldn't need it defined. A first sleep implies there's a second one, which means the night, for this family, and apparently for whoever might read this testimony without blinking, was divided into 2 separate sleeps with something happening in between. Once Ekirch knew what he was looking for, he couldn't stop finding it. Diaries, medical textbooks, court records, plays, ballads, letters. The concept of a first sleep and a second sleep, with a waking period in the middle that people simply called the watch, turned out to be everywhere in pre-industrial writing, mentioned so casually and so often that nobody in that era felt any need to explain it, the same way nobody today explains what they mean by lunch. It showed up in Chaucer. It showed up in French sources as premier somme, and in Italian ones as primo sonno. It showed up in colonial accounts from Brazil, in 19th century descriptions of life in Oman, and it stretched back, according to Ekirch's later research, at least as far as the Odyssey, written around the 8th century BC. This wasn't a regional quirk or a folk superstition confined to one culture. This was, for the vast majority of recorded human history, simply how people slept. Picture what an actual night looked like under this system, somewhere in the 1600s. As early as 9 or 10 in the evening, people would settle onto mattresses stuffed with straw, or if they were poor, onto scattered heather or bare earth. Sleep arrangements were communal by default. Families, servants, and sometimes total strangers traveling together would share the same bed, arranged by strict but unspoken rules about who slept where. After a couple of hours, people would simply wake up. Not from noise, not from an alarm, since mechanical alarm clocks weren't even invented until the late 1700s, and not from any disturbance at all. They woke up the same natural way you wake up in the morning, except it was the middle of the night, and everyone around them seemed to understand that this was completely unremarkable. Then came the watch. And this is where the story stops being about biology and starts being about how differently a culture can use the exact same stretch of dark, quiet hours we now spend unconscious or scrolling. Under weak candlelight or the glow of the moon, people used this window for tasks that needed doing, tending the fire, taking herbal remedies, checking on animals. For peasants, it often meant getting back to physical work, mending cloth or combing wool. For the devout, it was considered an especially sacred hour, prescribed for specific prayers, a period when, as one father in the tradition put it, no one would be looking for you except God himself. For the more restless minds of the era, it was a quiet stretch for turning ideas over, so useful that by the late 1700s, an inventor had designed a special notepad specifically for jotting down nighttime insights in the dark without having to light a candle. And for couples who'd managed to navigate the logistics of a shared, crowded bed, the watch was, by every account, an unusually good time for intimacy, a period historians associate with a noticeable uptick in conception. Mostly, though, people just talked. Bedfellows chatted in the dark with a kind of loose, unguarded informality that daylight conversation rarely allowed. Then, eventually, they drifted back down into a second sleep that carried them to dawn. This wasn't some marginal practice. It was mainstream enough that St. Benedict in the 6th century built a monastic prayer schedule around it, requiring monks to rise at midnight specifically to use the watch for psalms. It shows up in Roman writers like Livy and Pliny and Plutarch, casually enough to suggest it was already common knowledge centuries before that. 2 separate sleeps with a living, breathing stretch of activity between them wasn't a hardship people endured. It was simply the architecture of the night. So if this was the near-universal human pattern for tens of thousands of years, the obvious question becomes, where did it go? Why does almost nobody today split their sleep this way? And why does waking up at 2 a.m. feel like something has gone wrong with you rather than something completely ordinary? For decades, this remained a genuine mystery until Eckhart stumbled across something that connected his historical detective work to hard biology. In the late 1990s, he came across a description of an experiment conducted a few years earlier by Thomas Wehr, a sleep researcher at the National Institute of Mental Health. Wehr had taken a group of men and, after a week of observing their normal sleep, artificially shortened their exposure to light each day from the usual 16 hours down to just 10, leaving them the rest of the time in total, unbroken darkness with nothing to do but rest. For the first few weeks, nothing unusual happened. They slept in their normal single block. Then, around the 4-week mark, their sleep spontaneously split in 2. They began sleeping in 2 distinct segments of roughly equal length, separated by 1 to 3 hours of quiet wakefulness, and blood tests confirmed their melatonin cycles had physically reorganized to match. Nobody trained them to do this. Nobody told them about historical sleep patterns. Their bodies simply reverted, on their own, to the ancestral default the moment modern light exposure was removed. Eckhart has said that reading about Wehr's results was, apart from his own wedding and the births of his children, the most exciting moment of his life, which tells you something about how strange it is to find your archival research independently confirmed by a locked-room neuroscience experiment decades later. More recent evidence backs this up in an even more direct way. In 2015, sleep researcher David Sampson led a study in a remote village in northeastern Madagascar, a place with no electrical infrastructure at all, where nights are still nearly as dark as they would have been 1,000 years ago. Villagers wore small activity trackers for 10 days, and the pattern that emerged was almost a carbon copy of what Eckhart had found buried in 17th century court records, a burst of wakeful activity right after midnight, lasting roughly an hour, before people settled back into sleep until sunrise. Biphasic sleep, it turns out, never actually vanished. It's been quietly persisting in places the modern lighting grid never fully reached. What vanished was everywhere else, and the reason is almost embarrassingly simple. The Industrial Revolution didn't just bring factories. It brought cheap, reliable artificial light on a mass scale for the first time in human history, and with it came clock time, shift work, and a new cultural expectation that a proper night's sleep meant one long, uninterrupted block. Within a couple of generations, references to a first sleep and second sleep quietly stopped appearing in diaries and letters altogether, not because people decided to change, but because the environmental trigger that produced the split, real, deep darkness simply disappeared from most people's lives. Which means that when you wake up at 2 a.m. tonight, lying there mildly panicked about your broken sleep, you are actually doing something your ancestors did on purpose for thousands of years as a completely normal and even useful part of their day. Your body isn't malfunctioning. It's running software that predates written language, in an environment that stopped supporting it about 200 years ago. But sleep patterns are only one thread of what actually went on after dark, and honestly, they might be the least dramatic one. For most of human history, night wasn't just the time you weren't awake for the useful part of the day. It had its own economy, its own religion, its own crimes, and its own entire social world, largely invisible to us now because archaeology, as a field, spent most of its existence assuming the interesting stuff only happened in daylight. Take ancient Rome. If you picture the ancient world as quiet and dark after sunset, Rome will correct you fast. Because wheeled carts were legally banned from Roman streets during the day to avoid congestion, all the heavy provisioning of the city, the delivery of goods to taverns, the removal of waste, happened at night, which meant Roman streets were loud and busy for the entire night, every night. A poet living in the city complained in writing that the laughter of a crowd passing beneath his window woke him up, grumbling that all of Rome seemed to be gathered at his bedside. Citizens used the cover of darkness for everything from petty crime to simply dumping the contents of chamber pots into the street below. Rome even had a dedicated night police force, the Vigiles, established under Augustus, whose job was to patrol after dark and round up troublemakers, with the twist that the same official who'd been up all night arresting people was often the one who sentenced them in court the next morning, having presumably had zero sleep himself. This was not a sleepy, candlelit backwater. This was a functioning nocturnal city with its own infrastructure, built around the assumption that a huge amount of important human activity simply happened after the sun went down. Now travel across the ocean and several centuries forward to the tropical cities of the classic Maya, somewhere between roughly 250 and 900 AD. Picture a settlement as dusk falls. The heat of the day starts to break. Vision starts to fade, but the other senses sharpen to compensate, the way they always do in the dark. Jaguars move somewhere out past the firelight, invisible but audible. Insects rise into a dense, layered hum. Tropical flowers that stay closed all day begin releasing their scent into the cooling air. Torches and hearth fires crackle and throw long shadows against stone walls, doing double duty as light, warmth, and protection against whatever might be lurking, real or imagined, in the dark beyond the settlement's edge. For the Maya, night wasn't simply dangerous, it was sacred. Ruled by a moon goddess said to ride a deer across the sky, watching over anyone bold enough to be out in it. Royal figures performed midnight ceremonies involving thick, intoxicating cacao drinks and ritual dancing. Across the social spectrum, people practiced bloodletting after dark, using obsidian blades and stingray spines, offering their own blood to honor ancestors and appease the gods believed to govern the underworld, all of it aimed at one specific goal, making sure the sun would actually rise again the next morning. Night, in this worldview, wasn't empty time to get through. It was a live negotiation with the forces that kept the world running. Across the Atlantic in ancient Egypt, night carried a similarly loaded meaning, but through the lens of death rather than danger. Egyptians believed the sun god Ra died every evening in the west, plunging the world into darkness, and that the human dead traveled in that same direction, toward Osiris and the underworld. This wasn't just poetic language, it shaped real funerary practice. Archaeologists have found small lighting devices, essentially wicks mounted on sticks, depicted in the Book of the Dead and recovered from actual tombs, including King Tutankhamun's, objects whose entire purpose was to help guide the deceased safely through the darkness they were now believed to inhabit permanently. Artificial light, in other words, wasn't just a domestic convenience for the ancient Egyptians. It was technology built specifically for navigating the afterlife. And these are just 3 examples out of dozens that archaeologists working under the banner of the archaeology of the night, a subfield that's really only existed formally since around 2018, have started documenting. Bronze Age farmers in Oman irrigated their crops after dark, specifically because cooler night air meant less water loss to evaporation. Iron Age metalworkers in what's now Zimbabwe fired up their forges at night deliberately to avoid working next to open flame in the brutal heat of the day. At the 4,000-year-old city of Mohenjo-Daro in the Indus Valley, the unglamorous but essential task of clearing human waste from the streets was considered work specifically suited to nighttime, and the elaborate drainage infrastructure archaeologists have uncovered there suggests a whole invisible night shift of specialized workers keeping the city functional while everyone else slept. Polynesian mariners spent centuries navigating vast stretches of open ocean using nothing but the stars, memorizing sky maps passed down across generations, entirely dependent on clear night skies for survival at sea. Vikings burned fish oil, whale fat, and seal blubber in stone lamps to light the smoky interiors of their pit houses through the long, dark Scandinavian winters. And in the 19th century Bahamas, enslaved people used the hours after dark, the only time that wasn't claimed by forced labor, to slip into the surrounding bush, adorn themselves, and reconstruct fragments of African dance, music, and tradition that plantation life was otherwise designed to erase, laying the groundwork for what eventually became the Junkanoo Festival still celebrated today. Night, across every one of these cultures, wasn't a void. It was where an enormous amount of the most meaningful human activity actually happened, which raises another question worth sitting with. If night was this rich, why do we imagine our ancient and prehistoric ancestors as people who essentially shut down the moment the sun set, huddling passively in caves until morning? Part of the answer is that we've badly underestimated how sophisticated their relationship with darkness actually was, going back much further than Rome or the Maya, back to actual cave-dwelling humans tens of thousands of years before any of these civilizations existed. The earliest known human bed, discovered in a South African rock shelter, dates back roughly 200,000 years. It wasn't glamorous. It was a mat of grass, leaves, and branches laid down inside a cave, but it reveals a level of forethought that gets casually erased by every cartoonish image of a grunting, club-wielding caveman you've ever seen. Layered into that ancient bedding, archaeologists found the remains of specific plants known today to repel insects, deliberately included as a kind of prehistoric bug spray. And scattered through the different layers of the bed were traces of ash, evidence that these early humans periodically set their own bedding on fire after sleeping on it, almost certainly as a way of killing off fleas, lice, and whatever else had moved in overnight, then simply built a fresh bed on top of the burned layer. It's a strange image, somebody deliberately torching their own mattress as basic hygiene, but it's also a small, quietly brilliant piece of engineering from people we tend to imagine as barely capable of speech. There's a second, even stranger clue buried in our own bodies that seems to point even further back, to a time before humans slept on the ground at all. You already know the sensation. You're drifting off, muscles going slack, and suddenly your whole body convulses awake with the unmistakable, embarrassing feeling that you just fell. It's called a hypnic jerk, and it happens to somewhere between 60 and 70% of people. The leading theory for why this reflex exists at all traces it back to a much earlier chapter of our evolutionary story, one where our ancestors slept not on open ground, but up in trees, the way many primates still do today, precisely because height meant safety from ground-based predators. If you're sleeping in a tree and your muscles suddenly go slack the way they naturally do at sleep onset, that's not a neutral event. That's the exact physical sensation of starting to fall out of the tree you're depending on to survive the night. A reflex that fires a sudden emergency signal to grab and catch yourself the instant muscle tension drops would have been enormously useful up there. It would also, notably, be completely pointless once humans moved down to the ground and started sleeping in caves protected by fire instead of branches, which is presumably why the reflex just sort of persists uselessly in you now, 300,000 years later, jolting you awake in your bed for no reason at all, except that some extremely old part of your nervous system still thinks you might be 40 feet up a tree. Fire changed almost everything about how humans related to the dark, and it changed it earlier than most people assume, with control over fire generally placed at around 400,000 years ago. Before that, for roughly half of human existence on this planet, night meant actual, total darkness except on clear nights with a visible moon. Once early humans gained reliable control of fire, night stopped being pure exposure and started becoming something they could partially manage, push back the predators, extend the useful hours of the day, gather people around a shared source of warmth and light, and that gathering turned out to matter more than the warmth itself. Researchers studying modern hunter-gatherer societies have documented a consistent and fairly striking pattern. What people talk about during the day is different from what they talk about at night. Daytime conversation across culture after culture skews toward practical matters, complaints, logistics, who did what to whom. But once the fire is lit and the group settles in for the evening, the tone of conversation shifts towards storytelling, singing, and shared ritual, the exact kind of activity known to build social cohesion and reinforce a group's shared values. There's reason to think this wasn't incidental. The emotional impact of both music and narrative appears to land harder later in the day, particularly when people are tired, which would have made firelit evenings an unusually potent, almost engineered opportunity for cultural transmission, the actual mechanism by which values, myths, and survival knowledge got passed down generation after generation, long before anyone could write any of it down. It's worth pausing here on a fair objection, because it's the kind of thing a careful researcher would raise and a careless documentary would skip. How confident can we actually be that modern hunter-gatherer groups tell us anything real about how humans slept and lived 100,000 years ago? Anthropologist Matthew Wolf Meyer has pushed back on exactly this point, arguing that no group living today, however remote, is untouched by the modern world, and that treating them as a kind of living fossil risks flattening real cultural differences into a convenient stand-in for ancient humanity. It's a legitimate caution, but it doesn't erase the value of the comparison, it just narrows it. Anthropologist Frank Marlowe, who spent years living with and studying the Hadza of Tanzania, makes a related but softer point that while the Hadza obviously aren't frozen replicas of Paleolithic humans, what's genuinely striking is how much of their daily rhythm has persisted with remarkably little change since outside observers first documented them in 1911. The honest position sits somewhere in between. Modern hunter-gatherer groups aren't time machines, but they're the closest living approximation we have to a lifestyle shaped primarily by the same environmental pressures, real darkness, real physical exertion, no artificial light that shaped our species for most of its existence. That's not certainty. It's the best available evidence, treated carefully. There's also a layer of ancient nightlife that rarely makes it into the reconstructions, mostly because it's the part researchers have the hardest time studying politely. What did people actually do about privacy and intimacy once the whole group was bedded down together in one shared space? Studies of the Aka, a group of net-hunting foragers in the Central African Republic whose living arrangements have been closely documented by anthropologists, suggest an answer that complicates the cozy image of one big, undifferentiated pile of sleeping bodies. Sex, it turns out, was almost universally kept separate from the communal sleeping area. Some Aka couples described slipping off into the surrounding forest for privacy. Others managed it quietly within their own hut while everyone else slept. The Aka data also suggests monogamy was overwhelmingly the norm, not the polygamous free-for-all sometimes imagined for primitive societies, and researchers argue the deliberate covertness wasn't really about shame in the modern sense, so much as a practical way of avoiding jealousy and reducing friction inside a small group that had to keep cooperating with each other the next morning, regardless of what had happened the night before. In other words, even inside a lifestyle built around radical closeness, sleeping stacked together for warmth and safety, people still carved out small, private pockets of the dark for themselves. The instinct wasn't invented by modern bedrooms with locking doors. It's older than that, just solved with geography instead of architecture. Go back further still, past any living society we can study directly, into the actual physical bed itself, and there's a small mechanical detail that says a lot about how deliberately ancient people managed their nights. That 200,000-year-old South African bed wasn't just a mat for sleeping. Stone flakes recovered from its layers show it doubled as a workspace. Somewhere tools were shaped, hide scraped, food processed, the exact spot where a person would also, presumably, later try to fall asleep surrounded by their own debris. Streaks of red and orange ochre worked into the same layers suggest the bed was also where people decorated themselves or colored objects, blurring any line we might want to draw between workshop and bedroom. It's a small detail, but it reframes the whole picture. This wasn't a resting spot bolted onto the edge of a harder, more serious daytime existence. It was a multi-purpose hub where survival, craft, ritual, and rest all overlapped in the same patch of ground night after night for tens of thousands of years before anyone thought to separate those functions into different rooms. There's one more layer to how ancient humans structured their nights that connects surprisingly directly back to sleep quality itself, and it has to do with what they were doing during the day, not just after dark. Modern hunter-gatherer populations move an extraordinary amount compared to people in industrialized societies, with men in some groups averaging somewhere close to 19,000 steps a day and women around 11,000, against an average of roughly 5,000 for adults in the United States today. Researchers, including evolutionary biologist Daniel Lieberman, have connected this activity level to what's sometimes called the active grandparent hypothesis. The idea that humans who stayed physically active well into older age were more successful at helping raise grandchildren, which in turn meant natural selection favored bodies that could recover well from exertion. And recovery, notably, runs largely through sleep. High daytime physical activity combined with a diet naturally heavy in protein and light in refined sugar, both features strongly associated with better sleep quality in modern research, meant ancestral humans were, without knowing it, optimizing almost every input that determines how well a person sleeps. Meanwhile, modern life has quietly stripped out most of that activity, most of that dietary protein, and replaced total darkness with a bedroom full of glowing screens, which may explain why so many of us now treat a full, unbroken night's sleep as something rare and precious instead of the biological baseline it's supposed to be. There's an easy trap here worth naming directly. None of this should be romanticized into some vanished golden age of noble, spiritually attuned darkness dwellers. Infant and adult mortality throughout most of this history was brutal by any modern measure, and plenty of what happened after dark was mundane, uncomfortable, or outright dangerous rather than mystical. What's genuinely remarkable isn't that ancient people had some superior relationship with the night that we've tragically lost. It's how consistently, across cultures with zero contact with each other, on different continents, in wildly different climates, the same basic pattern kept reappearing. A night divided into purposeful segments, a body that woke on its own schedule rather than an artificial one, and a shared instinct to gather people together in the dark rather than scatter them. When completely unconnected human groups independently arrive at the same solution over and over, it's usually a sign you're looking at biology wearing different cultural clothes, not coincidence. None of this is to say ancient humans were living some kind of flawless nocturnal utopia we've tragically abandoned. They weren't. Alongside the storytelling and the ritual and the sacred stargazing, they also apparently spent a fair amount of their nights doing things that would sound very familiar to anyone who's had a rough night out. Archaeological evidence from a site in Utah shows charred tobacco seeds in a fire pit dating back more than 12,000 years, suggesting nicotine use goes back much further than most people assume. In China's Hainan province, residue analysis on ancient jars points to a fermented drink made from rice, honey, and fruit dating to around 7000 BC, and by roughly 5,000 years ago, actual beer, brewed with specialized pottery and identifiable barley residue. Hair samples from Bronze Age remains found on the island of Minorca contain traces of powerful psychoactive plant alkaloids, substances capable of producing genuine hallucinations, almost certainly used deliberately in ritual settings to shift consciousness during ceremonies. So the honest picture of ancient nightlife isn't some pristine, purely spiritual scene. It's closer to what you'd expect from any group of humans left alone in the dark with a fire, some intoxicants, and each other, which is to say, recognizably, uncomfortably human. So here's the full shape of it, all the pieces sitting next to each other. For nearly the entire span of human existence, night was not empty time bracketed by two useful daylight stretches. It was divided into two sleeps, with a purposeful waking hour folded in between, an hour used for prayer, sex, work, and conversation, a rhythm so normal nobody thought to explain it in writing until Roger Ekirch went digging through 17th century court testimony and found it hiding in plain sight. It was a stretch of hours with its own economy in Rome, its own theology in Egypt and among the Maya, its own specialized labor in the Indus Valley, its own navigation science across Polynesia. It was social glue around a fire, deliberately used to pass down myth and meaning in a register. The daytime brain apparently isn't as receptive to. And going back far enough, it was even a physical location, a bed built of grass and branches and insect-repelling plants, occasionally set on fire on purpose, that predates written history by nearly 200,000 years. Then, in the span of roughly a century and a half, almost all of it quietly disappeared. Cheap, reliable electric light arrived, and along with it came clock time, shift work, and the cultural conviction that 8 consecutive unbroken hours was the only correct way to sleep, a standard nobody actually lived by for the overwhelming majority of human history. Today, our nighttime footprint is bright enough to be photographed from space. Circadian rhythms, which regulate somewhere between 10 and 15% of your genes, are getting disrupted on a mass scale, with real, documented links to heart disease, depression, and quite possibly certain cancers. Migratory birds and sea turtles die navigating by artificial light instead of the moon. And an enormous amount of what used to be shared, communal, firelit time has been replaced by people scattered across separate rooms, each staring into their own individually lit rectangle of glass, together in the same house and functionally alone in the dark. Which brings you back to 2 a.m., lying in bed, awake for no reason you can name, quietly convinced something is wrong with you. Nothing is wrong with you. You are doing, in a much dimmer and more isolated version, something almost every human being who ever lived did as a matter of course. Somewhere behind your eyes, a genuinely ancient rhythm is trying to open up its old watch hour, the one your ancestors used for praying, for talking in the dark, for turning an idea over slowly with nothing pulling their attention away from it. You just don't have a fire to sit next to anymore, or a bedfellow murmuring next to you in the dark, or a culture that expects this and has a name for it and isn't the least bit alarmed by it. You just have a phone, a clock telling you exactly how much sleep you're losing, and the quiet modern assumption that any interruption in the dark must be a malfunction rather than an inheritance. Next time it happens, you don't have to fix it. You could just let it be what it apparently always was. Lie there. Let your mind wander somewhere. It doesn't usually get to go during the day. You're not broken. You're just briefly, accidentally keeping the watch.